Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this, our second in a new series of history classes all about the early history of America. And this week we're going to be thinking about the arrival of the British in America and other Europeans who were some of the first people to travel to that continent as well. And so on the screen we see this picture of members of the Virginia Company landing on the shores of Virginia to establish Jamestown, which is something we're going to come back to later in the class. We're really looking forward to your participation today. If you have any questions, or I'm also going to have some questions for you as we go through, you can either type your answers in the chat, or if you press the raise hand button, then I can unmute your microphone and hear you over the audio. Now, as ever, we may have some people joining who haven't been to see us at Benjamin Franklin House or haven't been to one of our virtual classes before. So we're going to start by explaining a little bit about who Benjamin Franklin was and why there's a house in London named after him. Now, I can see lots of familiar names amongst the participants, so I wonder if anyone could help me out here. Anything that anyone would like to share about who Benjamin Franklin was or what he was doing in London. So Claire has said two of his main jobs. He was probably best remembered as a founding father, but he was also a writer and a scientist and an inventor. And he actually started out his working life as a printer, as Esther and Elijah and Talitha are reminding us. And they said that he came to Britain and did lots of inventions and also became one of the founding fathers. Thank you so much. I also see a raised hand. Let me go to that. Oh, I think it's gone. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Yes, you're quite right. So here's Benjamin Franklin on the left. He was born in 1706 in Boston in America. And as I said, started out as a printer and then was able to do lots of work as a scientist and also a politician and diplomat. And that's really what brought him to England to live in the house you can see on the right of the screen. We call it Benjamin Franklin House today. It's on Craven Street, right in the centre of London. And he was representing America, or the colonies as they were known then, to Britain. And this was just before what would become the War of Independence that we're going to be learning more about later in this series as well. But today we're thinking about when Europeans really first went to America, so several hundred years before Benjamin Franklin was alive and before he came to London. So I'm going to start with some questions for you. Now, in our history classes, we're always thinking about the facts and the story of history, but we're also thinking about those historical skills. So my first question for you is, how do historians uncover the past? Can you tell me some of the things that they use to help them find out about the past? Right, so there are kind of objects from the past, so things like skeletons is one thing, as Claire said. Also writing, like diaries. Esther, Elijah and Talitha have said looking at original sources, so diaries would be an example of that. Also stories that people have written in the past, fantastic. I see a raised hand. Hello?
We use fossils and stuff. Oh.
What was that, sorry?
We use some fossils.
And bones.
And bones.
Definitely, so exactly, so we have archaeologists who find things out from fossils and bones. That's particularly really ancient history. Thank you so much. So objects as well that they might find, so tools that people might have used, their jewellery, different things from around their house. Sometimes verbal accounts, they might have been written down, or nowadays, of course, we have audio recordings that we can use. Also, we might find some little pieces of clothing that might survive, and then paintings and pictures as well. Brilliant, I can tell you're already such fantastic historians. You know all about the different clues. Historians really are like detectives uncovering the mystery of the past, and so those are some of the clues they use to help them. And I wanted to ask you that question because some of the history we're talking about today, there's some disagreement between historians, and that's partly because there might be some gaps in those primary sources that we would normally use to really create the whole picture of what happened in the past. So I wanted to give you that question first, just so that that's our background and we know that's partly why there's some disagreement about some of the things we'll be talking about today. And to get us thinking about that, I've got another question for you, which is, who do you think of as discovering America? If you were asked that question, who discovered America, what would you say? Got a couple of raised hands, that's great to see. Hello?
Kiddos, do you want to answer?
Yes. The native people of the New World.
I think
Native people of the New World.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, brilliant. So there are lots of people living in America before Europeans even came to the continent. So we're going to be talking about that in a moment. We have one more hand raised. Hello?
It was
Christopher Columbus.
Okay, so that is a name that lots of people associate with Europeans going to America. We're going to talk about that as well. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. And I can see that Native Americans, Indigenous people have been mentioned in the chat, as well as Christopher Columbus. Someone's also mentioned the Vikings, and we're going to come back to that too. Wow, I can see you already have lots of information you know already. So we are going to start by talking about Christopher Columbus and why some people think of him as discovering America. So here's a portrait of him on the left, and on the right is some diagrams of what historians think the voyages that he took across the Atlantic looked like. Now, as I said, this is history that people disagree about, and in fact, earlier this week, some Americans were celebrating Columbus Day as the day that's recognized as him arriving in America, but other people choose to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on that same date, and thinking of that as something that's better to celebrate rather than this kind of colonizing power coming to America. But so who was Christopher Columbus, and why do people think of him as discovering America in 1492? So Christopher Columbus was actually Italian. He was born in Genoa, and he was the son of wool weavers. When he was just 19, he completed an apprenticeship on a merchant ship, and so started making voyages around Europe. But then he wanted to make some travels across the Atlantic, and his reason for doing this was actually to try and find a quicker route to Asia. Because Europeans hadn't done much traveling across the Atlantic, they didn't realize they were going to come across this huge landmass in between Europe and Asia. So he would end up making 4 journeys across the Atlantic, and he would start his journey to his kind of attempts to do this when he was living firstly in Portugal in 1484. He asked the King John of Portugal if he would support him, give him the money to do that, but King John II turned him down. So he then went to live in Spain, and by 1492 he'd been able to convince Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain to fund his voyage, to give him the money to be able to make this journey to the New World, as they called it then. So in 1492 he set sail with 3 ships. They were called the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and there are about 90 men on board. So they landed on the small island that we now know as the Bahamas, and he called it El Salvador and planted a Spanish flag and claimed it for Spain. So you can see he then made some other trips if you look at the coloured lines on this map. And so he went to different places in the Caribbean, also parts of Central America and South America. So that's Columbus's story. And why then do people disagree about calling him someone who discovered America? Well, there's a few reasons for that. As some of you pointed out, we can't say he discovered America, since it had already been populated by people for a very long time. And Columbus himself thought he'd actually reached Asia when he had got to these places, and that's why he referred to the local indigenous people as Indians. And he also never actually, as you can see from this map, set foot in modern-day North America. He went to the Caribbean, Central America, and South America as well. He also didn't found any settlements, so any places that people would end up living. And we're going to come on to look at later in the class some people who did. So if that's Christopher Columbus' story, who would we say did come to America first? So in our last class, where we were looking at pre-colonial America, we looked at all about the Native Americans. And in terms of how they first came to be in America, the continent, we know that people have been living in America for at least 16,500 years, so a very long time. And during the last ice age, there was a kind of land bridge. So the land masses in the world were moving around, and there was a land bridge between Europe, or Asia, I should say, sorry, between Asia and North America. And this is referred to as the Bering Strait. So anthropologists believe that the first Americans came across this land bridge from Siberia. So that's in modern-day Russia. So those were the first people to come to North America. So that's why lots of people, when I asked who discovered America, spoke about Native Americans and indigenous people who lived there. And then in terms of Europeans, although Columbus was one of the first, it's actually thought that the Vikings traveled to North America much before him, the Vikings or the Norse people. And again, thinking about historians having those sources, there's some disagreement about who exactly was the first person to get to America. Some people think it was Leif Erikson, and some people think it was his father, Eric the Red, and other people think it might have been someone else. So historians don't always disagree, and certain sources might show one thing, and then there might be other sources that show a different story too. So that's the story of Christopher Columbus. Since our class today is thinking particularly about the British in America, we're going to come on to now thinking about the first explorer that England sent to America. And this was someone called John Cabot. He was actually Italian as well. His original name was Giovanni Cabot. And so he wanted to go across the Atlantic like Christopher Columbus. He also was looking for a faster route to Asia. And he had tried at several of the royal courts around Europe to get the money and the support to make that journey. But he didn't get that backing, that funding, until he went to England. And at the time in England, the king was Henry VII, and he was impressed by John Cabot, as he was known in England. And so in 1497, he funded a voyage to the New World, as they called it. So this voyage started off in Bristol. You can see we've got a portrait of John Cabot on the left. This is actually from a fresco in Venice. And then on the right, we've got this map of his journey, or what's thought to be his journey. So he set sail from Bristol in 1497. The ship was called Matthew. And unfortunately, a lot of the logs from this journey were lost. So thinking back to what we were saying about sources, that means that it's quite difficult to know the details of the journey. But we do know that it took about 50 days. And he's thought to have landed in Newfoundland, in modern-day Canada, and he may even have gone to Nova Scotia as well. But as we were saying, we're not entirely certain because of there being these gaps in the original source material that historians use to piece together the past. So what happened after John Cabot? What came next? Well, Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, who you may have already learned quite a bit about, wasn't so interested in exploring the world. He had quite a lot going on at home, which you'll probably know if you've learned about him already. But his daughter, Elizabeth I, was very interested in exploring the world and also in having more trade. So going and finding products that could be traded with other countries. So under Elizabeth I's rule, there was a gentleman called Sir Walter Raleigh, and it was through his involvement that the first colony or settlement was founded in America, but it didn't last for very long. So let's hear the story, and this is the Roanoke colony. So Raleigh had inherited a royal patent, which is kind of like permission from the king or queen to go and found or establish a colony in America. So at this point, Spain had already settled in Florida, and also Spain was a very powerful nation at this point. It ruled most of Western Europe, There would be the wars between Spain and England, so that might have been some of the motivation for Queen Elizabeth wanting to send someone out to establish a colony in America. So in July 1584, 2 ships went out to kind of find a suitable place for this new colony, and they came back to report that some land they had visited in North Carolina would be suitable for farming. So the next year, in April 1585, 7 ships carrying 600 soldiers sailed across the Atlantic, and they were under the command of Sir Richard Greenville, who was Sir Walter Raleigh's cousin. Now, the reason they had so many soldiers with them is because they were worried about attack from the Spanish. So there were these tensions between Spain and England at the time. So after landing in an area called Pamlico Sand in North Carolina, they moved more inland, so away from the sea, to establish a fort and settlement. So this was at Roanoke Island. So at that point, Greenville and most of his fleet returned to England to bring back supplies and more settlers. They left about 108 men behind, and they were under the command of someone called Ralph Lane. However, it didn't take long before supplies started running out, and because they were desperate for food, they started stealing from the Native Americans who lived there, and of course that caused lots of hostility. So in the next year, in 1586, another English explorer called Sir Francis Drake arrived in America, and actually the settlers decided to go back with him. So they didn't give up though. Raleigh sent another ship in 1587, which was captained by an artist who was called John White. And he actually took his pregnant wife, who was called Eleanor, with him. And they gave birth to their daughter Virginia in America. So that was the first English child who would be born in America. So soon after he arrived, White returned to England for supplies, but his return to Roanoke Island got quite delayed, partly because of this tension between England and Spain. There was the wars that were happening, and so his boat got caught up in that, and he didn't make it back until 1590, so 3 years later. And at this point, everyone had vanished. The only clue that was left was the word Croatoan, which had been carved into a tree. I can see a raised hand. Hello?
Hi. We think the Native Americans killed them.
Okay, you think there might have been a war after they'd been stealing?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other ideas? I can see a comment in the chat. So Esther, Elijah and Taz think they gave up and moved back because there was a lack of food, or that there was a lot of sickness. Some really good ideas, and you've come up with some of the theories that historians have. So let's have a look. So some theories. So one theory is that, like was suggested, that they might have been killed by the Native Americans. Another theory is that they might have relocated to a nearby island, which was called Croatoan, so why they left that name in the tree. Like another person suggested, they might have tried to sail back to England, maybe got lost at sea. Another theory is that they could have been killed by the Spanish. Remember, they'd settled in Florida already. Perhaps they might have actually been absorbed into a Native American tribe and began living with them, and maybe their name was Croatoan. And someone mentioned possibly they got sick, so yes, possibly because they didn't have the supplies and they didn't know yet how to farm the land, then maybe they might have died because of hunger. So some really good historical guessing there. And let's find out about what the next colony that England would try to found was called. So another English explorer who was very interested in North America was someone called Bartholomew Gosnell. Now, he was from an area in England called East Anglia, and he came from quite a wealthy family. He was well educated, he studied law, but he was just absolutely fascinated with America and the New World. So he wanted to go and explore it as well. And so in 1602, so some years after the Roanoke Island they tried to settle in Roanoke Island and it hadn't been successful, he went to try and set up another colony. And he was funded by someone called the Earl of Southampton. So he set sail with just one vessel called Concord, and he himself was the captain. So we have a kind of recreation, a sculpture of what we think he would have looked like here on the left. And then we have a picture of him, a picture of the boat arriving in America as well. So he was the captain himself. He only had about 32 members of crew, and he landed in Cape Elizabeth, which is close to modern-day Portland in Maine. And he called the area the Elizabeth Isles in honor of the Queen, Elizabeth I. And it's also believed that he named Martha's Vineyard, close to that area, after his own daughter called Martha. So similar to the stories we heard before, this attempt ran out of supplies as well, and they also kind of ran into some disagreements with the Native Americans that they came into contact with. And so they would soon set sail, and they did take lots of the wood that you could get in America that we didn't have in England, so cedar and sassafras with them. But then came the time for a settlement that more of you might have heard of. We saw an image of it at the beginning of the class, and this was Jamestown. So let's find out the story of Jamestown. So in 1606, so soon after Gosnell had had his journey to America, the new king, James I, granted the Virginia Company the exclusive rights to go and create a settlement in Virginia in America. So the Virginia Company was privately owned, and its investors were wanting to explore America. They wanted to try and grow their wealth by kind of using lots of the natural resources and riches that there were in America. So in December of 1606, 3 ships set sail. They were called the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, and they were carrying 100 men. It took them quite a long time. It took them 4 months. This is partly because they stopped in what we now know as the Canary Islands and also in Puerto Rico, and then they landed in Cape Henry on the 26th of April, 1606. So they then set about finding appropriate land that they could build on, and they began work on constructing a fort. So we've got a picture here, a depiction of what Jamestown would have looked like on the right. So you can see it's triangular in shape, and it was very carefully selected. So you had, there were rivers all around it that would help to protect it and also keep it supplied with water. And you can see that there are lots of cannons and things protecting it from attack as well. So the Jamestown would go on to confront quite a lot of problems, partly not because they didn't know how to farm the land around them. They also, although they were helped initially by Native American tribes, eventually they would run into conflict there as well. And so it took several years for it to become a successful colony, but it did eventually get established. And so we're going to find out more about Jamestown and also the founding of the other colonies in America in our next month's class, which is going to be all about those original 13 colonies. Hello?
The whole colony got disease.
And harsh winters, wind. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So they would struggle with the environment, with the weather, and then also yes, they got lots of illnesses and things. So before it got really established, there were there was a lot of death that happened initially, and then they kept persevering and would eventually successfully settle the settlement. But we'll find out more about what happened next and the other colonies in next month's class. We're coming towards the end of the lesson now, but I wanted to suggest, before we go, I wanted to we will talk quickly about the other European countries that were in America. So we've spoken about a couple of them, but I wonder if you know which other European countries sent explorers and settlers to America around this time. So Claire has said France, absolutely. We think of any others that might have been there. So not Germany actually, but some other European powers were. I see a raised hand. Hello?
The Netherlands.
What was that, sorry?
The Netherlands.
Yes, yes, the
Holland.
Dutch. Exactly, the Dutch. Fantastic. Okay, yes, you're quite right. So we'll just look at some of the famous explorers from other countries in Europe. So we spoke a bit about the Spanish, and I mentioned already how they were actually the first European power to settle in America. And so that was in Florida, that was in 1565. And so that area of America was actually ruled by the Spanish for a very long time. It didn't become part of the United States until 1821. So there's a big Spanish influence in that part of America. The French as well sent explorers, and you probably know that in modern day Canada, Quebec, the area on the east coast, speaks French, so there's this historic link there. And the first settlement that they tried to create was in modern day Quebec City in Canada, modern day Canada. So the Dutch were also sending explorers, particularly from the Dutch East India Company. And then the Italians, so Italy as a country wasn't actually sponsoring these voyages, but a lot of the explorers that we've mentioned were Italian. We spoke about Christopher Columbus and also John Cabot. And then another important one was the gentleman who's pictured here, Amerigo Vespucci, and he's actually where America gets his name. And he was the first to recognize North America and South America as distinct continents as well. So lots of exploration from different powers in Europe. And then before we end the class, I just wanted to make a suggestion of an activity that you might like to try as a follow-up to the lesson. So, and that is to have a go at writing your own diary account of either a journey to America at this time and coming to this new place for the first time, or as one of the settlers who tried to establish a settlement. So whether that be in Jamestown or Roanoke Island, and the kind of difficulties that they encountered. So on the left, we've got Christopher Columbus's journal as an example. You can see the dates and then the entries, and this should actually say Sir Walter Raleigh's journal. So a lot of these explorers were keeping records of their journeys, and that's one of the important primary sources that historians can use to find out about this period of the past. So thank you so much for joining today and for all your brilliant participation. Did anyone have any questions before we end the class?